Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students, how are you? We are going to have a description on history of syntax, which is the topic of morphology and syntax basics. And we have earlier taken into account the basic concepts regarding the sentence and its parts. So morphology, as you know, that the morphology is a science and the study of the smallest grammatical units of language and their formation into words, including inflection, derivation, and composition. According to Dorfman, morphology is the study of the ways and methods of grouping sounds into sound complexes or the words of definite, distinct conventional meanings. Bloomfield calls it the study of the constructions in which bound forms appear among the constituents. Broadly speaking, we can say that morphology is a study of the patterns of the word forms. It studies how the words are formed. So, if we can say in this context, so if morphology is the level of structure between the phonological and the syntactic, it is complementary to syntax. Morphology is the grammar of the words, so syntax is the grammar of the sentence. So, one accounts for the internal structure or the form of the words, the other describes how these words are put together and in an ordering form in a sentence. So the topic of description is the history of the syntax. And prior to describe the history of the syntax, so first take into account what the syntax is. The word syntax is derived from a Greek word meaning ordering together, systematic arrangements, or putting together. It is a study of sentence building, of the ways in which words are arranged together in order to make larger units. So, syntax is the order or arrangement of words and phrases to form proper sentences. We can arrange and rearrange adjectives and adverbs, insert phrases, and more in order to make the larger units of the construction. In linguistics, syntax is a set of rules, principles, and processes that govern the structure of sentences in a given language, usually including word order. So, the term syntax is also used to refer to the study of such principles and processes. The most basic syntax follows a subject plus verb plus direct object formula, that is, subject plus verb plus object. This is a simple sentence formula. The real joy in syntax comes with the ability to compose sentences in a variety of the different ways. And this shows the variety of the language. That is, in language, shows the various compositions of just like the subject, verb, and object. They are just like explaining the simplest this formula, but in a different way, in a variety of the different ways, using the different choice of the words and other things even. Function of syntax. The function of syntax is to study sentence structure and formation. It involves setting rules for creating coherent and grammatically correct sentences by focusing on word order, phrases, clauses, and the relationships among them. When we write, our message efficacy depends more heavily on syntax. So, as far as the function of the syntax is concerned, that is, our efficacy of our message depends upon the construction, choice of our words, the choice of our vocabulary items, and the way of our expression. And the syntax plays an important role in making our expressions. So, when it is said that The function of syntax is to study sentence structure and formation. That is how the different words, different parts of speech are to be arranged together in order to make a forceful expression and how they are formed. So, one way to explore syntax is to know clauses. And these are, that is, when we talk about, that is how, just like these syntax rules involve the coherent and the grammatically correct sentences. That is, not only that is we follow the arrangements, we follow the ordering, we must follow also the coherence and the coherent aspects. So these aspects just like creates the beauty of your expression. That is how it also creates the connectivity of the speech, and that is how the connectivity in your writing and expression. And we talk, that is we must, if we can gain these all aspects while focusing on the word order and while putting the phrases and the clauses in relationships among them. So when one way to explore the syntax is to know the clauses, and there are, we know that there are the dependent clauses and the independent clauses. And we know that an independent clause is the one that can stand alone and form a complete sentence. A dependent clause, however, cannot stand on its own. For example, if we take the example over here, hurrying to the door, she picked up her purse and ran. So in this case, hurrying to the door is an independent clause, because while uttering this phrase, this clause, that is, we are not liable just to create the whole meanings and creating the whole sense. And this phrase, this clause depends upon the another independent clause. She picked up her purse and ran in order to elaborate its meaning. And we know that as far as the sentences are concerned, that is when we talk about the sentences na, that is we know that sentences are of the two kinds, of the two very basically of the two kinds, that is the simple and the complex one. Otherwise we have the simple, the compound complex. These are the categories, and these are the types of the sentences, but we talk about only the simple sentence and the complex sentence. So, one of the best ways to improve our syntax is to move beyond the simple sentence. That is, when we can, if we concentrate on only the simple sentences, just if we concentrate or just to make the students to focus only on the subject plus verb and the object formula, that is, we just take on the very simple sentences and just we can't understand the variety of the language and the various uses of in this respect. Na? So the grammar is the rule book. So grammar tells us to punctuate a sentence, capitalize proper nouns, and so on. So syntax is the application of the rules. All follow these rules. This is how to apply, where to put the capital letter, where to put the punctuation marks in a proper order, where it is necessary. So these are all the applications of the syntax rules. Levels of syntax. Three levels of syntax include the following: lexical syntax, concrete syntax, abstract syntax. Lexical syntax include all the basic symbols of the language, all the lexical items, the names, the values, operators. Concrete syntax, these are the rules for writing expressions, statements, and programs. And abstract syntax, it is the internal representation of the program specified by a simpler grammar than the concrete syntax. Now comes the history of syntax. The history of thinking about and describing syntax goes back thousands of years. But from the perspective of theorizing about syntax, Noam Chomsky's syntactic structures presents valuable examples. The contemporary history of syntax can be usefully understood in terms of the few fundamental questions. That is, when we talk about the history of the syntax, it includes the history of the thinking. It also includes that is how the different concepts come into the mind of the persons and the linguists and the historians, and even the just like we're making the expressions in this context. That is how the syntax goes back thousands of years. And in this respect, Noam Chomsky's syntactic structures is the best example, presents the best valuable examples. So, as far as these questions are concerned, that is, the first question is what is the nature of syntactic structure? What is the status within syntactic theory of grammatical functions, thematic roles, syntactic categories, branching structures, and invisible constituents? What is the right way to account for the linear order? What is the right way to capture generalizations about relatedness of constituents? What is the explanatory role of processing in accounting for acceptability, judgments providing basis for syntactic theorizing? So, these questions, one person can pose all these questions while studying the history of syntax. And these questions are useful in order to reopen open and reopen the ways various ways before the persons and the historians and one of the just like who are doing the researches in the linguistic fields, that is how the history of the syntax goes back in the thousands of years, and how the history of the syntax plays an important role in order to have the modern theories of the syntax and the modern theorizing and the different rules that is we are following in order to make our language capable of creating the variations. So there are two quite distinct areas of the syntax. One is related to morphology and the other wholly or largely unrelated to it. In the past, morphology dealt with the ways in which words are built up, and syntax with the ways in which they combine with each other to form sentences. It was Saussure who pointed out that morphology has no distinctly autonomous object. It can't be distinguished from syntax. It was Saussure who demonstrated that lexicology can't isolate it from either syntax or morphology. So it means that Saussure was the first person who made the correlation between the three items, that is the lexicology, syntax, and morphology. So morphology, syntax, and lexicology interpenetrate because every synchronic fact is identical. Grammar and grammaticality. A central assumption of MGG, mainstream generative grammar, this is the abbreviation of this term, is that a language is a set of string of words and morphemes that meet a set of well-formedness conditions. That is, according to mainstream generative grammar, language is a set of string of the words and morphemes. In MGG, these are expressible as rules. The rule, that is, the grammar is a rule book. If it is to be said elsewhere, if grammar is to be considered as a rule book, that is how these rules are to follow in order to make the string of the words and morphemes, and how these words and morphemes are put together in order to make a continuous whole, in order to create the continuous expressions. The rules constitute the grammar of the language and are part of the native speaker's linguistic knowledge. That is, we wholly and partially derive the certain rules, that is, the rules from the native language. And we know that is, these rules constitutes the grammar of the language and are part of the native speaker's linguistic knowledge. That is, we derive rules from the native speaker's linguistic knowledge. The evidence for a child learning a language consists minimally of examples expressing the language produced in context. The descriptive problem for the linguist is to correctly determine the form and content of speaker's grammar. Since aspects Chomsky, it has been assumed in MGG, mainstream generative grammar, that the grammar is only imperfectly reflected in what a speaker actually says. Prior taking to the examples relating, let's first discuss the evidence for a child learning a language consists minimally of examples expressing the language produced in context. Because child is exposed in the mother tongue and the child is learning that language automatically on account of the LED language acquisition device. So that device is already, that software is already in the brain of the child, and that's producing the context because he is imbibing the grammar elsewhere else, just like to be spoken in the surroundings, and is taking the imprints of that grammar. And the child learns the language in this way, that is fully exposed and in that perspective, and he learns the various string the words and how these words are to be arranged in a proper order, step by step. That is, when in the learning of the child language, when comes the one word stage, the two word stage, the three word stage, and at last the stage comes when the child is capable of making the string of the sentences. The descriptive problem for the linguist is to correctly determine the form and content of the speaker's grammar. And Chomsky, in this respect, reflects the speaker actually what the speaker actually says. For example, when it is said, "The police arrested Sandy." Police the This is the correct one. The police arrested Sandy. When it is said, "Police the arrested Sandy," it is incorrect. It is incorrect and ungrammatical. It is ungrammatical because the follows rather than precedes the head of its phrase. That's why. Syntactic structures and a standard theory. Constituent structure. And these are the parts. These are the parts. Sometimes these are to be included as the noun phrase, the verb phrase, preposition in the preposition phrase, or sometimes just like we denote it as a subject plus verb plus object. These are the constituents. In SS means the syntactic structures. Syntax is understood to be the theory of the structure of the sentences in a language. Bloomfield argued that in order to account for the meaning of a sentence, it is necessary to recognize how individual constituents, and these constituents, the words and the morphemes, constitute more complex forms. In essence, basic or kernel sentences were derived by the successive application of rules such as, first take these. In syntactic structures, syntax is understood to be the theory of the structure of the sentences in a language. That is, the theory has become, that is, when we talk about the subject plus verb plus object, this is the simplest one. And Bloomfield argued that in order to account for the meaning of the sentence, it's necessary to recognize how individual constituents constitute more complex forms. That is how they get out of the simplest form to make the more complex forms. And the chief concern of the syntax is the sentence, which is the maximal unit of the grammatical analysis, and the minimum syntactic level is the morpheme. Which means that at the minimum level, we just talk about the morpheme, which is a meaningful whole, which is a meaningful unit, and out of these morphemes, we are going to make the long string and the long stretch of the sentences. Sentence may be analyzed segmentally into phonological units called phonemes and syllables, into morphological units called morphemes and words, and into syntactic units called phrases and clauses. So, in this way, segmentally and morphological units, and talk about the syntactic units. So, we have divided up to these complex forms, and when it is to be segmentally, it is to be divided into phonological units, and these are when we divide the units into the phonological one, so it is to be termed as the phonemes and the syllables, and when it is the morphological units is to be described as the morphemes and the words, and into the syntactic units they are called the phrases and clauses. So when it is said that in essence basic or the kernel sentences were derived by the successive application of the rules, such as we have this example: sentence into NP and VP. NP, this is the phrase structure rules, noun phrase and the verb phrase, and then the verb phrase into the verb and the noun phrase in the articles and the noun, and verb we have the arrested, articles the and a, the definite article and indefinite article, and noun the police students. And the sentence is what? The police arrested the students. So here the is the article, police is the noun, and the whole when we talk about the noun phrase, police arrested the students, the noun phrase, arrested here in this case is the verb, and arrested the students in this case the verb phrase, and the students again, these are the noun. The is the article and the students is the noun. Immediate constituent analysis. It's also called as the IC analysis. IC analysis is one of the strongest method of analyzing a sentence linguistically, because we are going to study and we are going to take into account the basic linguistic units. Like these are the noun, the verb, the adjectives, the prepositions, the articles, etc. The constituents are nothing but the morphemes, which when structured into successive components form utterances. This is very simple. The term IC analysis was introduced by Bloomfield in 1939, who illustrated the way in which it was possible to take a sentence like poor John ran away and split it up into immediate constituents, the poor plus John plus ran plus away. Here the poor is adjective, John is the noun, the ran is the verb, and away, just like it shows the adverbial conditions. This is the IC analysis. Transformations. The fundamental innovation of SS was syntactic structures, was to combine IC analysis. This was said by Harris in 1951, that sentences with the same words and meanings are systematically related. For example, the active and the passive are essentially synonymous and differ only by the arrangements of the words, and in this case B. The inflectional on the main verb by. The police arrested the students. The students were arrested by the police. The first one is the active voice, and the another is the passive voice. And when we, at the same time, sentences may be described suprasegmentally in respect of the length, stress, pitch, and intersegmentally in respect of syllable, transitions, and that of the juncture. Some linguists, notably of the school of transformational generative grammar, TGG, transformational generative grammar, are trying to study the maximal linguistic units through a fusion of all these approaches. So, nevertheless, syntax not only to the transformational generative grammarian but also to the number of other linguists in the core, the center of the grammar, and the linguist also interested in two aspects of the structuring of the language. The first one is they are interested in the patterns underlying the sentences and its constituents. And number two, they are interested in that syntactic devices used to link the constituents together and the rules that transforms one structure into other. The rule that transforms the one structure into another. That is how the active voice is to be transformed into the passive voice. Deriving the passive from the active by a rule captures not only their synonymy but also the distributional facts. Distributional facts, that is how the subject and the verb are to be just like to be arranged and distributed the initial and the final stages. Chomsky argued phrase structure rules are not sufficient to characterize linguistic competence. More complex sentences were derived by SS syntactic structures by the applications of generalized transformations that apply to multiple simple sentences. For example, the police arrested the students. The students were protesting, and when it is written, the police arrested the students who were protesting. This makes a more complex construction. The shift to the standard theory. The shift from the SS theory to the standard theory in Chomsky was marked by three innovations. Since any order of application of the same rules produces the same structure, since the full expressive power of generalized transformations is not needed, instead of rewrite rules, it was assumed that there is a lexicon that specifies the properties of individual lexical items. So, in this respect, we can say that the one task of the linguist is to formulate and test hypotheses about what the language are, that is to determine the grammar. The linguist hypothesis and the native speaker's knowledge are both called the grammar. And so these makes the transformational and the generalized transformational rules in this respect. And it is also assumed that on the basis of this evidence, the learner arrives at a grammar. The grammar provides the basis for the speaker to produce and understand utterances for the language. And for Harris, we know that such relationships were captured through transformations of strings of the words and morphemes. In essence, such relationships among sentences are captured in terms of transformations of structures. Chomsky notes that in essence, the passive construction has distinction or the distinctive properties. The passive participle goes with be. A transitive passive verb lacks a direct object. The agentive by phrase may appear in the passive but not in the active. The passive could be described independently of the active, but such a description would be redundant. Chomsky concludes that this inelegant duplication can be avoided only if we deliberately exclude passives from the grammar of the phrase structure and reintroduce them by a rule. Levels of representation in the standard theory. Chomsky, 1965, proposed that there are two levels of syntactic representation of a sentence: deep structure and surface structure, related by sets of transformations. The meaning of a sentence is determined by deep structures, while the surface structure corresponds to the observed form, including linear order. So, thus, a phrase structure characterization of the phenomena can capture the fixed, but at the expense of generality and simplicity, as in the case of English passive. It is assumed in standard theory as the previous tense and phrase structure rules. It was assumed that complex sentence structures are also specified by PSR, phrase structure rules, extended to allow for recursion. And what's recursion means? It means the co-occurrence. It is the property of the PS rules. So that permits an infinite expansion. A lexical item is inserted into the structure so that is compatible with its properties. For example, a transitive verb is inserted into a sentence structure only if there is an NP in VP. NP means the noun phrase and VP is the verb phrase. So as far as the surface structure and the deep structure is concerned, the surface structure is actually produced structure. It refers to the sentence as it is pronounced or written. The deep structure is the abstract structure that allows the native speaker of the language to know what the sentence means. So the surface structure is that which takes into account the transformation. It is a deep structure of a sentence that tells us what the speaker means by the sentence, and the surface structure shows how actually uses it in communication. It may then be said that the deep structure expresses the semantic content of the sentence, so whereas the surface structure of the sentence determines its phonetic form. Transformations function as a link between the deep structure of a sentence and their surface structures. So just take the example: visiting doctors can be nuisance. This is the surface structure. While its deep meanings elaborate, doctors visit us, they can be nuisance. So according to Noam Chomsky, the deep structure of a sentence is the abstract underlying form which determines the meanings of a sentence. It is present in the mind, not necessarily represented directly in the physical signal. The surface structure of a sentence is the actual organization of the physical signal into phrases of varying sizes, into words of the various categories with certain particles inflectional arrangements, and so on. Constraining movements. A central consequence of the hypothesis is that there are at least two transformally related levels of syntactic representation, as that constituents move from their underlying positions to their observed position in the structures. That is, they are moving from underlying positions to their observed position in the structures. An example of the movement is the derivation of the passive construction. Another example is seen in English WH questions, like, what are you looking at? And in this context, we can say that deep structure object moves to the surface structure subject. Another is the movement of the English inflected auxiliaries. And these are the examples. That is, another is the movement like Sandy will call, will Sandy call. So Emmons in 1970 observed that the passive transformation yields a structure that conforms to the general pattern of the language as characterized by the PSRs, that is, it is structure preserving. Chomsky in 1964 observed that extraction of a WH phrase from the certain syntactic context is less than fully acceptable. The question arises how this knowledge could become part of the learner's grammar. Chomsky argued that there are syntactic universals that constitute the human capacity for the language. But Emmons proposed all the transformations except except those apply to the highest level of the structures. So all transformations are assumed to be structure preserving. A distinctive characteristic of such constructions in languages like English is that there is no principled bound on the length of the chain. Like if we take the example, the Mary saw the boy walking to the railroad station. This is a syntactic universal, and the examples of the constituents shows a human capacity for the language. Chomsky shows that in above example, the extraction of NP corresponding to the boy walking to the railroad station can be understood as a reduced relative. Modifying the boy, he concluded that who must be constrained in the structure. Who must be constrained in the structure. So that's why it is written, Mary saw the boy walking to the railroad station, and who is constrained in this in this perspective in order to make a just like a meaningful sentence. And this is the syntactic universals. And assuming that learners form grammars on the basis of the utterances they actually experience. It means that is they are directly taking the just like what the speaker is speaking and what is the expression is written. They are taken up the direct experience with the native speakers, with the other English speaking people, and in this way they make their own expressions, which are based on their actual experiences. That constitutes the human capacity for the language. Uniformity. Uniformity basically aims at eliminating redundancy in grammatical formulations. It's like to make the uniform whole and just to eliminate all the redundant aspects of the grammatical rules and the regulations. Just like we have over here different types of the uniformity conditions. First one is a interface uniformity, which is termed as IU, is the assumption that sentences with the same meaning share a syntactic representation. It means that if meaning is determined by deep structure, as in ST sentences with the same meaning have the same deep structure representation. For example, the active and the passive are derived from the same representative or the same representations, and the passive transformation doesn't affect the meaning. This point was generalized as transformations in general, so don't all as change meaning. Number two is the structural uniformity. That is how uniform structures are made when to be arranged the different constituents in a sentence. It requires that if two constituents in two different sentences have the same grammatical function, then they have the same underlying representation. The third one is the derivational uniformity, which requires that some structures are derived by transformations. Sameness of structure is captured by assuming derivational uniformity. Conclusion: the history of syntax shows a wide variety of theoretical alternatives, both internal and external to MGG. Nevertheless, it is possible to see significant convergences, for example, the role of the lexicon in projecting syntactic structure and dissociation of the linear order and hierarchical structure. At the same time, there remain fundamental open questions, such as whether grammatical functions are primitives, the nature of syntactic categories, the relationship between syntactic structures and semantic interpretations, the status of syntactic constructions, the distinction between core and peripheral phenomena, the distinction between grammaticality and acceptability, and origin and status of syntactic constraints. No doubt, these issues will continue to animate the field as they have since its inception. So, besides these, it is also assumed, so as in the IC analysis, which attempts to break down the constituents into such parts they are in some sense grammatically relevant, and these morphemes, when the morphemes are to be discussed, when we are discussing the syntax, are the ultimate constituents of the sentence. It implies that these elements are not further just like to be distributed at the syntactic level. So all these things having that is all things which we have discussed in the history of the syntax. So it is argued that if it is possible just to study the role of the lexicon in projecting the various structures, so it is also possible, that is how we can study the synchronic aspect of the linguistics when we study the history, and when we study the linear order, and how do we dissociate the linear order, and how the linear order is perfectly acceptable so when we are making the structures of the language, and especially when we study the IC analysis. And that is how these constituents help in order to make both the just like they are coming from the simple sentences to make more of the complex one. Just like if we take the example over here, If we misorder the words of a sentence of a language, such as English, the judgment of unacceptability is very strong and reflects the knowledge of the unacceptability is very strong, and the knowledge of what the order should be. Just like if we take the example, Sandy divulged the answer, but I would never do it. And another is, Sandy knew the answer, but I would never do it. Intuitively, we can say that the difference between the two sentences is that do it can refer only to an action, divulge denotes an action, so while no does not. So since B is ill formed, that is a B sentence. That is, a Sandy knew the answer, but I would never do it. It is ill formed. For semantic reasons, the burden of explanation can be borne by the semantics. The distinction between the grammaticality and acceptability was highlighted by Miller and Chomsky in 1963, who observed that a sentence can be well formed in a sense that it follows the rules of the linear ordering, phrase structure, and morphological form, but is nevertheless unacceptable. The distinction between grammaticality and acceptability has not played a significant role in syntactic theorizing until recent. These are the various references. I've taken up all these materials from these sources, and hoping that that may help you in order to reinforce your studies and reinforce your intention in order to make the research in these respects and make more valuable findings in this respect. That's all. Thank you very much.